Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. So, I'm talking this morning about Master Joshu, one of the most famous of the masters of the golden age of Zen. He was a Tang Dynasty Zen master towards the end of the Tang Dynasty, and depending on the transliteration system you use, there are several of them. Joshu is the Japanese pronunciation. He's also called at various places Chow Chow or Zhao Zhao. And I'm quite sure that no matter which pronunciation we use, it's wrong. So I sometimes wonder why there's so many variations, and why don't we just use Joshu because it's simple. I'm sure it's no further from the actual pronunciation than anything else. He lived from the year 778 to 897, it said, which means he lived 120 years, if we're to believe the record. And he didn't start teaching till he was 80, which makes me feel a lot better about my late start in formal Zen teaching. Joshu, supposedly, I didn't count, but supposedly collections more than any other master. And so in the greatest hits of the koans, you could say that Joshu's like the Beatles. You know, he's kind of eternal. He pops up again and again and again. It was quite interesting looking into a little bit further into the era he lived in, the Tang Dynasty, which lasted for some centuries, and saw the rise of Buddhism and Zen despite several different campaigns to try to eliminate Buddhism from the country several times. The Chinese civilization at that time, they had something like 50 million people and 50 million citizens of the country. They had an extensive, complicated system of government that included tests for civil servants, and they had to actually take tests, and there was a extensive bureaucracy. And you think during this time, Europe was completely in the Dark Ages, and there were just basically barbarians running around, and China had this very, very advanced civilization. Of course, like any place else, China had its problems. The emperors, if you read into the various emperors, they came and went, they killed each other, they killed the next heir. It said that they had an empress for a while who killed at least one of her children, and killed various other people to stay in power. We think we have problems, right? So there were various famines and rebellions. In fact, Joshu, after his master, who was Nansen, died, when Joshu was 60, he went on pilgrimage. And during this period, there was a great suppression of Buddhism, and most of the temples were destroyed in the country. And it was said that he lived off of, they said he lived off of trees. I don't know exactly what that means, but I imagine him eating leaves and berries and fruits. And they say he made his clothing out of weeds during that period. So it must have been kind of rough at that time to be a Buddhist. So, but Joshu's teacher was Nansen, as many of us know, and there are many famous stories about Nansen as well. There's this book I recommend if you're interested in Joshu. It's called Radical Zen, and it's the record of of the sayings and doings of Joshu. And one of the reasons I'm drawn to Joshu is that he was a proponent of what's called, sometimes called lips and tongue Zen, which means most of his teachings were spoken and were quite direct. He wasn't the kind of teacher who shouted quats, which I kind of wonder sometimes what the good of shouting quats is anyway. I think, the Dharma is a little more direct than that. And he wasn't known for, there's a couple of occasions where he slapped someone or got slapped, but in general, he wasn't one of those teachers who was always hitting or shouting. He often pointed to, he was very Taoist influenced, and often he pointed to just very simple examples to show what, when he was asked complex questions about, or even simple questions about, the way those questions would go. What is the way? Why did Bodhidharma come from the West? Basically questions that are asking, what's the Dharma? What's the Dharma about? And he'd point to the tree in the garden, or he'd say, go wash your bowls. A lot of us know some of these cases. His first encounter with Nansen came when he was 17 years old. He went to see the master, and I'll read you one account of the encounter, which is Nansen asked the young, at that point, he was known as Songshen. Joshu later took the name of the town that he settled in, where he finally began to teach at the age of 80. But let's just call him Joshu for simplicity. So Nansen, of course, did the usual thing of asking, where have you just come from? And Joshu answered, I just came from Shushang Temple. And Nansen asked, have you seen the famous standing statue of the Buddha there? Joshu said, I have not seen the standing Buddha, I only see a reclining Buddha. Now Nansen at the time was lying down, apparently. So obviously he's kissing up a little, if you ask me. He's saying, no, but I see a reclining Buddha. Of course, the guy's only 17 years old, so you got to cut him some slack, right? So Nansen sees that this young fellow has some, has a little bit of spunk, at least, to be able to speak to him that way. And he asks, do you have a teacher? And Joshu replies, oh, yes, I have a teacher. And Nansen says, well, who's your teacher? And Joshu says, the midwinter cold is now very severe. I'm happy to see you enjoying such good health, Master. So this is obviously his way of saying, yeah, I want you to be my teacher. And so Nansen accepts him. There's a famous case some years later where he has a dialogue with Nansen, and which results in his first enlightenment experience. And probably this is familiar to many of you. So one occasion, Joshu asks Nansen, what is the way? And Nansen says, everyday mind is the way. Joshu then says, well, can one reach towards it, or can one approach it? Can one grasp after it? And Nansen says, if you try and approach it, you'll miss it. And Joshu says, if I don't try and reach it, then how can I know it? Nansen says, the way has nothing to do with knowing or not knowing. Knowing is merely deluded consciousness. Not knowing is just non-differentiation. When you enter the real way, it'll be like the great sky. How could it be right to argue within oneself whether it's right or wrong? So Joshu at this point is, I don't know, maybe he's in his 20s. It's interesting to reflect on the most famous koan, actually one of the most famous koans in the whole collection, which is the koan in all the collections, which is the koan mu, which we which we probably all know is the first koan in the Mumonkan, the first real book of koans that we all practice. And the famous case, of course, is a monk asks, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu says, mu, meaning no. So in the later version, or the complete version of the koan, there's another monk who asks him later, and he says yes. So now this dialogue probably would have happened, if it happened at all, because a lot of these things are legendary. But and actually, if you go back in the record, there are earlier cases of monks asking masters whether dogs have Buddha nature. So who knows if Joshu ever had that? But for the moment, we'll accept that that dialogue was real. And so later, the case comes up again, and Joshu says to one monk, no, the dog doesn't have Buddha nature. To another monk, he says, yes, he does. It's striking to me that this dialogue with Nansen, many years earlier, maybe as many as 60 years earlier, 50 some years earlier, Nansen's pointing to no right and no wrong. So, so we see Joshu in telling one monk that the dog has Buddha nature and saying to the other that he doesn't. We see him not getting caught up in right and wrong, right? He's responding to the moment. I assume, I would suppose that he's responding to the particular needs of those monastics. One monastic is attached to one side of the question, the other's attached to the other side. So Joshu will say anything that works, right? Like many of the great masters. So aside from being one of the most well-known masters because of many of his cases having gone into the koan collections, Dogen, who, if you've read Dogen, you know he's not, he doesn't hesitate to criticize other masters, even masters of old, but he doesn't have a word to say against Joshu. And one of Dogen's quotes about Joshu is, there was no Joshu before Joshu, and there was never a Joshu after. So Joshu stands alone in Dogen's regard as the one great master on whom there's not much to say because he said it all, right? D.T. Suzuki as well said that Joshu was of all the teachers of old was closest to his heart. So Joshu practiced with Nansen for 40 years until Nansen died, and then he stayed for several years. At the point Nansen died, Joshu was 57. He stayed for several years in mourning, and then when he was 60, he went off on pilgrimage, and he met most of the great masters of the time, would have tested himself in dialogue with them. And he was known for saying that if he met a 7-year-old child whose wisdom was superior to his, he would follow that child and learn from him. If he met a 100-year-old person whose wisdom was inferior to his, he would follow that person and teach him. So he was known for his humility and directness. Personally, I admire Joshu for refusing to get caught up in philosophical dialogue. These statements that to some degree can appear paradoxical to us, like he's asked about the way and he says the tree in the garden, or he says wash your bowls, or such things as that. Joshu was unwilling to assign meaning to things beyond the things themselves. So That's very Zen-like approach. We all tend to come to the Dharma thinking, this can't be it, right? And you can imagine, despite the togetherness, how advanced the civilization was in China at that time. It was quite a golden age in civilization, really worldwide. It was one of the great civilizations of the world he was living in. Nonetheless, there are rebellions, there are wars. Emperors are killing each other. Emperors are killing their children, so they won't succeed them to the throne. Children are overthrowing the emperor so that they can get to the throne. All these things were happening. It would have been just like it is in our era to look at our political situation, social situation, and just go, okay, the true way's got to be somewhere other than here, because this sure ain't it, right? So Joshu's always pointing back to where you're going to find it if not here, right? Because Zen practice is always about reality. Where does reality happen except right here in this moment? This is the only place it's actually happening, right? We all know this, but because we have these minds that can fabricate and imagine, we imagine that there's something beyond what we're living now, that it's got to somehow be somewhere else. The real thing's got to be somewhere else. But if you think about what reality is, we all know it's happening here now. We're spending our whole lives together. This is the whole deal, right? This is it. This is the only reality. Then where else are we going to find reality? Isn't it funny? As human beings, we're the only creatures who can talk ourselves out of the reality we're living in into some other supposed reality. So to go back to the famous case of the dog, the other day I was walking in the hills near our house, and barreling out of the brush comes this really enthusiastic dog. And he comes barreling out at 1,000,000 miles an hour, circles around me about 10 times, boom, goes zooming off into the distance again. Then I hear some voices, and the voices are approaching. He obviously ran back to the people he was with. He comes back to me, comes zooming around. He circles me about 5 times, stands at my feet, gets pet, goes, runs off, boom, runs off again. The few minutes later, the voices get closer. The people come out of the brush, and I have a little chat with them. And the dog comes up, and I start petting the dog. And I look down. I realize that this incredibly fast, vigorous dog only has 3 legs. It's only got 1 leg in the back. You know, it's a 3-legged dog. These are fairly common in Taos, and I like to use the 3-legged dog for the 3-legged dogs in general as an example, because sometimes I ask my university students, what creatures share the earth with us, human beings who, when they're not actively suffering, they have what they need to get on with their lives and aren't actively suffering, seem pretty satisfied with being alive. And people will say dogs, people will say cats, sometimes people will say children. And then at a certain point, somebody will go, well, basically every other creature who shares the planet with us is basically satisfied as long as they're not actively suffering, right? And it seems to me that this is the kind of thing Joshu's pointing to again and again. Hey, what's the problem? The problems are made here, right? Now, if you can imagine, give that dog human consciousness. In fact, I joked with the people who came up around it, because it was only after I was talking to the people and petting the dog, all of a sudden I said, oh, he's only got 3 legs. How is he so fast? How is he so fast? It's just incredible. They said, of course, he was a rescue. He'd been hit by a car and was obviously all healed. And I wouldn't have known he was lacking a leg. And he didn't seem to know he was lacking a leg, right? So you give the dog human consciousness, adult human consciousness, and you can just see how easy it would be for the dog to ruin his life, right? You can imagine the dog thinking, My God, why did I chase that car? I knew I shouldn't have chased that car. I knew I was going to get in trouble. My mother told me, my parents told me, my masters told me, don't chase cars, Fido. But did I listen? No, I didn't listen. So I went off, I chased the car. Look what happened. No, dog's not thinking that way, right? Dog's not thinking about the past, regretting the past. The dog's, sometimes I boil things down by saying there are three problematic areas of thinking in Zen: past thinking, future thinking, and present thinking. That kind of covers all the bases, doesn't it? Of course, thinking is also wonderful, right? We're all sitting in some sort of dwelling that was built by thinking, by planning, by learning from the past. As human beings, we have to do that. But this kind of thinking apparatus is wonderful for building houses and many other things, but it's not so good about figuring out how to be happy and how to get on with life in a way that's satisfactory. The dog does much better without thinking about it, right? So the dog's not dwelling on the past thinking, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I should have known better, right? How stupid I was. The dog's not thinking about the future either, thinking, well, so all very well and good that I've got 3 working legs now and I can run around, but how about when I get older? Dogs live 7 years to every one human year. What have I got, 5 more years? Then my other limbs start failing. What's it going to be like? They're not thinking that way either, right? Dog's not thinking about the future. And then present thinking, the problematic part of present thinking mostly has to do with judgment. So the dog's not thinking, I'm not as good as Rex over there. He's got 4 good legs. I've only got 3. The lady dogs aren't going to like me. I'm lesser than the other dogs. I'm not a good dog anymore. Just not thinking that way, right? Our little dog, Monty, who is also a rescue, he's 12 years old now. He has no idea he's 12 years old. He acts like a puppy. He's a little Chihuahua. He has no idea he's little. He has no idea he's 12 years old. And he's only got 5 teeth, and he has no idea he only has 5 teeth. He can eat fine. He can bark fine. He can run around fine. He's a very happy little dog. He's not doing that comparing mind thing. And he's not asking about the meaning of life. He's living the meaning of life. Sure, he can be unhappy. Sure, he can be happy. But somehow we think the meaning of life has to do with only one side of things, the happy side, not the unhappy side. So one of the things that Joshu points to a lot is things just as they are enough. We're not going to get to some world where bad things don't happen. We're not going to get to some world where, sometimes I'll run into one of these new age people who'll be saying, oh, we create our own reality and I can manifest anything I want. Well, those are 2 different things. Do we create our own reality? Well, there's great evidence for, even in the scientific world, that space and time don't exist independently of the way we see them, that there's a consensual way that beings experience space and time, which actually makes it appear that way. And there, who knows, the next universe over might be built on completely different things than space and time. We can't quite imagine what those factors might be that builds that universe, but this is the way we see this universe is very conditioned by the kind of sensory apparatus that we have. So it's true to some extent we create our reality. For instance, the dog sees color different than we do. Dogs are largely colorblind. They only see a few different colors. So does blue exist independent of the way humans see blue? I don't know. Do I even see blue the way that Eddie Lee sees blue, or the way Miozan sees blue? We have no way of knowing. It's our perceptions are colored by our senses and by our preconceptions, by what we think about them. So I sometimes say to people when they say we create our own reality, well, yeah, we do, but does that mean we control it? That's That's the fallacy there. To some degree, we create the way we see things through our perceptual apparatus, but controlling it is a whole other matter. Could you say we create children through our activities? Well, yes, but anybody who's ever created a child knows that they're not controllable, right? Or only controllable to a certain degree. I'll sometimes say to those people who say, we can manifest anything. I say, okay, we'll manifest never having a problem with your teeth for your whole lifetime. It's not a very simple thing, right? It's not possible, right? You're never going to manifest never having a problem with your teeth, not if you live long enough, right? So Monty, our dog, just accepts that. He doesn't mind having just 5 teeth. He's fine with that. We're a lot more concerned about his teeth than he is. So, so a few more things about Joshu. Of course, we'll come back to dogs later because we always come back to dogs. We always come back to dogs when we come back to Joshu because of Mu. But Joshu, of course, is the name of, like many of the masters he took when he settled down to teach at age 80 in a pretty wrecked and ruined temple. It was in the province of Jo, and the town nearby was called Joshu, and so he took on the name of Joshu. So in other words, if we did that, Shishin Roshi would be called Master Bertha. So maybe we should just stick with Shishin Roshi. But anyway, that's the way they often did things. So their name was the name of the area they were from. So there's a number of stories in the record. I'm sure you've heard some of them where somebody comes to Joshu and asks, what is Joshu? And they're kind of playing with the name of the town versus the name of the master versus what is the meaning of life and who are we anyway? And or they're asking, what is the way? So there's a couple of those famous stories. One visitor asks, what is Joshu? And Joshu says East Gate, West Gate, North Gate, South Gate. So the towns in that time would have gates, and he's basically saying you can enter by any of those gates. All the directions are open. So reality's right under our feet. Reality's right before our eyes. Of course, it can take us a lot of practice to realize that reality's right before our eyes, right? That's kind of, we hear again and again that Buddha nature is essentially what we are. We have Buddha nature, we are Buddha nature already, and yet we tend to come to practice because we don't feel that way, right? So Master Hakuin, who also greatly admired Joshu, was one of his favorite masters of old. Incidentally, Hakuin also studied practice with the koan Mu, like many of us have, and he practiced for quite a long time, struggled with it quite a bit, and had a lot of difficulty with it. So did I, so did many of us. In fact, Muman, Master Muman, who gathered the Mumonkan, was said to have worked with the koan Mu for 6 years before he saw it. But to Joshu's saying that that the gates are all open, right? And Hakuin, in addressing this issue of Buddha nature, used the analogy of water in its various forms. So if Buddha nature is water, then, well, you could even say we're all made of water. But then Hakuin extended the metaphor by saying, how about when water becomes ice? Is it still water? Well, yes, it's still water. But to see it as water, you have to melt the ice, right? So we are like that frozen water. We are Buddha nature, but we can't always see it. One metaphor Hakuin pointed to was Zazen is a means by which we can melt the water. We can melt the ice and become fluid and realize that the true nature of water. In other words, we can use Zazen to soften ourselves perhaps a bit, and then perhaps we'll see our Buddha nature as well. Not a bad metaphor, it seems to me. Another visitor came and asked, apparently in the town of Joshu, there was a famous stone bridge which was said to be an engineering marvel, and people would come to see it, tourists would come to see it. One visitor asked Joshu to tell him about the Stone Bridge of Joshu, again asking, what is the way to Joshu, the teacher, or what is the way? And Joshu replied, horses can cross, donkeys can cross. So it's interesting to me that they had the same kind of distinction between horses and donkeys or asses that we have. He's saying anyone could cross, the gates are open, right? It's right here, it's not to be found anywhere. Joshu's approach also went to, as his fame grew as a teacher, and it said that he taught for 40 years, from age 80 to 120. Of course, you got to know that in China, longevity was a whole giant deal. So the cooler you were, the longer you lived, the cooler you were. You know, if they want to raise up the story of a teacher very high, they're going to claim he lived a long time, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I did an article for Tricycle Magazine when the other Joshu Sasaki, turned 100, at the age of 100. And I went to his center, which was here, one of his centers was here in New Mexico, and he was giving a talk at the age of 100. I did this article for Tricycle on it. And yeah, you look pretty young for 100, just like Roshi Shishin is over 80 now, and he looks pretty young for over 80. It's Master Joshu Sasaki started to decline pretty promptly after that. And in fact, even though he looked really young, he had to be helped up when he stepped down after his talk because he could barely walk. And I think he lived to 106 or something, although he said he was going to outdo Master Joshu. He was going to live at least as long as Joshu. He didn't quite make it. He did, however, have a sex scandal at age 105, which, well, not many people can make that claim, you know, to have a sex scandal at age 105. So we don't really know about his age. He seemed to have lived a long time. So as his fame spread, various officials, high officials, and people would come to see him. And, you know, older teachers would have this high seat, which is like Shishin Roshi has a high seat. It's a chair in our Zendo, but it becomes difficult to sit cross-legged for many people when they get older. And so there's often this raised seat that allows them to put their legs down. And apparently when very high officials would come to visit Joshu, he would stay on the high seat. He wouldn't come down to meet them. When a medium official would come to visit, he'd get down from the high seat and meet them at the door to the hall meditation or the hall where they gave talks, the Dharma hall. If an ordinary person came, he'd go out and meet them at the gate. So you gotta love that, you know. He didn't. Well, it's not that he didn't take notice of the rank of people, which was a giant deal in China, of course, the rank of people. But he tried to even out the ranks by his action, right? And he was admired for doing that. So to go back to the koan mu, which is how most of us first encountered Joshu, and many of us have worked on the koan mu. And many of us, even if we've worked through it once, will work through it again because it appears later. So as I said before, the first way it appears is as Joshu being asked whether the dog has Buddha nature, and he says mu, which means no. And this no is not to be taken literally, as I think we probably all know by this point. I've got to say, mu is a great koan to begin with because it's so ungraspable, right? It's just this phrase, just mu. And we can't even apply the simple definition of no to it because, of course, we know that the teaching is that all things have Buddha nature. So all things sentient and insentient are said to have Buddha nature, or were certainly thought to at that time. So even a rock is made of Buddha nature or conscious, universal consciousness, if you want to call it that, whatever you, or the absolute. So in sitting with mu, it's not a question of yes or no. In fact, it's such a big no that it wipes out yes or no. So it's like the no of no self. Well, the teachings say that there's no such thing as individual self nature, right? But on the other hand, here I am, and I'm not the same as Chris, and I'm not the same as Corin, right? And that's pretty obvious, and it would be silly to say otherwise, right? But they're pointing to something else. They're pointing to something larger, right? There's no essential freestanding individual self in the way we seem to think that we exist, and in the way that causes us so much trouble, so much suffering. Right? So mu is, Corin put me onto this book called The Book of Mu, which is quite interesting, and I've been looking through it. And one teacher described Joshu's mu, or Joshu's no, as the no her mother screamed when the police came to the door and informed her that her 20-year-old son had just been killed in a bicycle accident. That no that the mother shouted at that point, the no that wipes out everything. That's the kind of no that mu is. Or it brings to mind the Nagarjuna's fourfold negation. If you apply that to the fact that once Joshu says mu, meaning no, the dog doesn't have Buddha nature, another time he says yes, the dog does have Buddha nature. Part of what that koan is saying in its complete form, which includes yes and no, is that language is dualistic. We can't pin reality down to one side or another. Yes and no are human concepts. Right and wrong are human concepts, right? It's somehow our notion of what Buddha nature is wants to exclude what we think is wrong. It wants to exclude the negative things that happen, the suffering that happens. But if it's a complete vision of reality, it has to include the whole thing, right? It has to include that. If you apply Nagarjuna's fourfold negation to the question of yes or no, does the dog have Buddha nature or doesn't it? It would go something like this. You can't say the dog does have Buddha nature. You can't say it doesn't have Buddha nature. You can't say it both has and doesn't have Buddha nature. And you can't say it neither has nor doesn't have Buddha nature. In other words, the fourfold negation wipes out all avenues of logically deciphering reality, right? That's what it's meant to do. It's meant to take us back to, boy, here we are. And we actually don't know why. We actually don't know why we're here. One of the reasons that I'm attracted to Zen is it just accepts that, accepts not knowing. In fact, it values it very highly. It accepts that we're living a great mystery that can't be penetrated through the thinking mind or through logic. It can be lived. It can be lived into. Doesn't mean it's boring. Doesn't mean it's dull. Well, sometimes it's boring. Sometimes it's dull. Sometimes it's exciting. Sometimes it's wonderful. Sometimes it's ecstatic. Sometimes it involves suffering. It just is what it is under our feet. And the problem is we don't see the miracle that it is, right? We don't see the miraculous nature of Soen Nakagawa, one of the early Roshis who brought Zen to America, Japanese teachers who brought Zen to America, used to say, incredible miracle, incredible good fortune. One sperm meets one egg, results in you. Amazing. And it is true. What are the chances? What are the chances that, a particular sperm out of thousands and thousands and thousands of them meets one particular egg? What are the chances of our parents even meeting out of billions and billions of people? And then out of all the eggs and sperm that they go to mix together, those two connecting and giving rise to us? And then all the things that happen to bring us to this moment, to the fact that we can even practice Zen. I think of my father, who I suspect was very much like me in many ways. And when he came of age, at the point he abandoned our family, which would have been in the late 1950s, when he was suffering, he had nothing to look towards except the Catholic Church, which didn't work for him, or psychoanalysis, which he couldn't afford. So where's he going to find? There was no Dharma for him to find. He couldn't practice these things that we take for granted. We have this amazing opportunity, just like Joshu did, in the midst of lots of trouble, to encounter and practice the Dharma, maybe even for 120 years if we're lucky. One of the lessons of Joshu, I suppose, is that there's no particular hurry, right? That to melt the ice of the self and really see our true nature, to really see the true nature, just like our little dog Monty. Well, he lives true nature. He doesn't have to think about it. He doesn't have to see it. He just lives it. For us to go back to such simplicity of just living, and he's pretty joyful being, like most dogs are, like many animals are when they're not suffering. They're perfectly satisfied, right? Do we have days where we don't suffer? Oh yeah, we have plenty of days where nothing bad happens to us that makes us suffer. But do we have days where we don't suffer because of what's happening here and here? Probably not. So one of the interesting things to look at is when we find ourselves suffering in a moment or on a day where nothing bad has actually happened, or maybe one bad thing happened in the morning, we're still suffering at 8 p.m. We're still going over and over in our minds, what's happening? Can we return to that kind of simplicity that Joshu's pointing at? Maybe we should go out and just look at the tree in the garden, or just go wash our dishes, or look at our clothing. Right, one of his answers to what the meaning of life was is I forget how many, 7 pounds of flax or something, which basically means the cloth that's used to make clothing. Joshu's living in such a way that he sees the miracle everywhere. And so I think his lesson to us that's prevailed over hundreds and hundreds of years, many centuries, is, hey, the miracle is right under our feet, right? So Joshu's worth looking into. I don't know about you, but I get tired of the teachers, the stories of teachers who shout and hit. It's, I think, it seems a little sloppy to me, right? Surely there's got to be. They say of Joshu that when his lips and tongue Zen was so powerful that when he spoke, a kind of light seemed to shine from his lips. So I think, his teaching was not explaining life, which can't be explained, but it was demonstrating through the use of language, sometimes through using language in unconventional ways. saying again and again that the Dharma's right here, the Dharma's right before us. We just have to melt the ice or cleanse our vision, right? And we'll see it too. I'll leave us with one recorded saying of the many recorded sayings of Joshu. Monk asked him, "What is the word of Joshu?" And Joshu said, "I don't even have half a word." And the monk said, "But Master, aren't you standing right here before me?" And Joshu said, "Yeah, but I'm not a word." All right, thank you all for listening.